Humza Yousaf has pulled the plug on the SNP-Green coalition. I don't think anyone is going to miss this particular government. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what led to the collapse. Most likely, it seems the Greens were most annoyed by the Scottish government's or by the SNP's abandonment of quite stringent climate targets. They were promising initially to cut carbon emissions by 75%, I think, by 2030. It seems as if the SNP are quietly annoyed by the Greens' almost rejection of the Cass review. So there's a sort of gender aspect to this. That's certainly what is being suggested on in some quarters. What have you made of this collapse? You certainly won't miss them, will you?
No, I will in a way. I think the Scottish Greens are a fantastic boost to most of the causes that I care about. I mean, there's this bizarre selection of people, Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater, and is it Maggie Chapman?
Yeah.
Who's someone who's on record as saying that both the 8-year-olds should be able to change their sex and also that Hamas are all right, really. That's not exactly what she said, I should clarify. But, you know, making excuses.
October 7th was an act of decolonisation rather than terrorism.
And I'm sure
don't believe the media who say it's terrorism.
And I'm sure she claimed that she just didn't realise what had properly happened and whatever. But, you know, the record is what the record is, Maggie. But I think they've been a fantastic boon to a lot of the causes that we care about. So I'm sad to see them go. They're a bizarre parade of people. But it's interesting because I think it's the coalition, I mean, it's not a coalition government, but the coalition agreement that they had, I think was quite striking as far as the willingness of the SNP to almost prioritise this project of kind of social engineering over what they're supposedly set up to do. Now, obviously, they share the cause of independence with the Scottish Greens, but at the same time, the fact that they got so bogged down in gender self-ID, in green politics to a certain extent, despite the fact that to be so pro-green and to be engaged in a campaign for Scottish independence makes absolutely no sense when the whole economic case for it was based on the oil and gas reserves. It makes no sense whatsoever. But I think it's just an interesting reminder that whole kind of period of SNP rule propped up by the Greens, sometimes formally, sometimes informally over recent years, was that they so often took their eye off the ball because whilst they were nominally about liberating Scots, really their main project was remaking them in their own image. So it's an interesting point. I mean, it is just entire the fact that you've got the fact that it's gotten to the point with the gender issue that even as thoroughly up to their necks in gender ideology as the SNP are, they have to kind of cut loose the Greens because they're making them look bad. I think it's good at least that they're sensing which way the wind's blowing on these issues, even if it's far too late in the day.
Definitely. Charlie, what have you made of it?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a case of you hear a rumor that your girlfriend's going to dump you, so you quickly call her up and say, by the way, I'm not so keen on this. I mean, after the climate change panel, the committee that came out with that ruling, it seemed pretty obvious, according to the reporters up there, that this was coming.
Yeah.
But it points to the fact that the SNP at the moment aren't particularly good at politics, that they've done this because it seems now most likely that there's going to be a vote of no confidence.
Yeah, probably next week.
And he might lose his seating as the First Minister. And in a remarkable turn of events, the person who might hold the power here, because the Greens are likely to come out against him, is Ash Regan, the Albert MSP, who lost to Humza Yousaf in the first round of the election for the leadership last year.
Formerly the SNP, then defected.
Yeah, defected to Albert. And Humza Yousaf said at the time that she was no great loss.
Yeah.
And now she holds the key to whether or not he keeps his job, basically. And for that to happen in basically a year, to go from this great leadership moment to the person you booted coming through to return the favour, is a disaster from the SNP's perspective. What happened in Scotland during the latter half of the SNP's reign, what happens next we'll see, but an early election is likely, I think, after this vote of no confidence. But what happens later, what's happened in the latter half, I think is going to be quite indicative of what might happen to England after the next general election, because the SNP has tried to do quite a lot of politics with not a lot of money. And if the polling is right and we're going to have a Labour government in the UK at the next election, I think they're going to find themselves in a similar position. And instead of having the economic and financial maneuverability to pull the strings that they want to achieve the economic ambitions they have, they might instead be restricted to culture war politicking, which, as both of you can attest, there's been no shortage of from the SNP since they took power.
And Scottish Labour has supported every move
turn
on that front.
Every
the
turn.
Hate Crime Act, the Gender Recognition Bill, Anas Sarwar now trying to distance himself from that stuff. I mean, and what's funny is you remember people lots of people complained to the police about Hamza's speech,
Yep.
where he said, listed out all these senior Scottish jobs and then said white after them. And Sawar gave almost exactly the same speech. It's absolutely bizarre. So you're right, Charlie. I think, if we see Keir Starmer, I mean, we know that Keir Starmer tries his best to distance himself from those culture war things, but
having taken the knee himself at the peak of that issue.
He's naturally inclined to want to go there, and then has to be dragged back, kicking and screaming when he hears about what the focus groups.
And there are so many potential elements here that could shift Starmer in certain ways should he become prime minister. But I think it's certainly the case that his premiership at the start, if the polling is right, might be quite weak. He might be very reliant on support from the left of his party. And also what happens on the other side of the House, should the next leader of the Conservative Party be rather similar as the last four or so, e.g. very permissive of quite a lot of so-called like woke culture war stuff, this sort of politics might come back in England in a more powerful way, and in Wales, of course, by virtue of the same sort of, there's no cash for anything, we need to be loud, let's support the London Mayor renaming the tube lines the Lioness line or something like that. Or do some remarkable situation like you just described where Yousaf was saying that it's appalling that there are so many white people in Scotland or thereabouts.
And I mean, it's funny because Scotland has been a sort of test case or laboratory for terrible authoritarian ideas. All of them seem to blow up in the SNP's face eventually. The Hate Crime Act seems as if it's been almost neutered successfully by J.K. Rowling at this point.
It's kind of collapsed under the weight of its own ridiculousness. When they had like 7,000 complaints in the course of the first week. Yousaf is the biggest alleged hate criminal in all of Scotland at this point because of that white speech that he gave in a country that is 96% white. So it's you shouldn't have really been that surprised. But it was telling because this has been the SNP's raison d'etre since they came to power. Yes, they've been campaigning for independence. Yes, they got scarily close in that referendum back in 2015. But it was also the fact that they were, from the off, obsessed with these issues of culture, of social engineering, of authoritarianism. One of the first things they do is to pass bans on offensive chanting at football. That's one of their kind of set piece policies that then gets rolled back eventually. They tried and failed to introduce the name person scheme, which everyone's sort of forgotten about now. But this genuinely Orwellian attempt to assign a state guardian to every child born in Scotland, incredibly chilling, ended up getting caught, held up in the courts effectively.
They would want to know whether how your child's room is decorated, what television programs they watch, in case people were unsure about how sinister this plan was.
And then, of course, then you move into gender self-ID and the hate crime legislation. It's like this movement that is supposed to liberate Scotland, but it doesn't trust Scots to raise their own children or tie their own shoelaces or walk down the road without being overcome by the hate monster.
Or buy 2-for-1 pizza.
And all the lifestyle
minimum
stuff.
Pricing. The smacking ban that we're debating
everything
here at the moment, that was passed in 2019.
But this is a feature, not a bug, I think. There's this thing about kind of technocratic centre-left, but not always politics, which is to say that the reason that we are in government is to improve the public. And I think they're a perfect example of that. And I think a lot of people in Scotland, and Ian McWhirter's piece on Spike this week makes this point quite powerfully, is that what was presented to them as, Scottish solutions to Scottish problems, and this is a way in which devolution will really mean that the bread and butter issues are properly dealt with in a way that faraway Westminster can't. It's just become from the off a project of how can we make you horrible, racist, child-beating lot slightly better. And they haven't got a lot to show for it as a consequence.
Do you think they get away with it, Charlie, because they pose as anti-English, but really the target of all their laws are Scots?
I think they pose more often as diplomats. The way that they're treated when they come to London or when they're treated in the English media is really quite remarkable because they're treated as emissaries from a foreign country. There isn't the same level of political criticism and engagement with the media that you might get from, let's say, I don't know, Plaid in Wales. You get this sort of approach that we're speaking to the Home Secretary from Latvia, so let's not pry too aggressively into their domestic policies because who are we to criticise a foreign nation? And they're treated as if they are representatives from a foreign land, and I think there's a reason why perhaps we don't get very many SNP moments in the media for right-leaning platforms. GB News in particular often struggles to hear from the SNP, perhaps because they anticipate that the questioning might be a bit more direct than
They
what
might
they
get
anticipate
criticised
elsewhere. Well,
rather than-
there might be a few more questions than they're usually used to. I know that the media in Scotland is a bit more pugnacious, but I think by and large, people don't have the same understanding of what the SNP is actually up to across the rest of the United Kingdom.